Everybody. Great to see everyone again. I'm Paul Grand. I'm the CEO here at Medtech Innovator. For those of you who haven't been exposed to Medtech Innovator before, we are an accelerator for medical technology, devices, diagnostics, digital health technologies. We are the largest medical device accelerator in the world, which means we have exposure to some of the most innovative companies in the world, and we get to work with the largest corporates in the world as well to bring the two together. And the whole mission is to take these technologies and make sure they succeed in reaching patients. That's our mission here at Medtech Innovator. As part of our accelerator, we run this webinar series each week in our Asia Pacific program. It's on Wednesday mornings. So you're joining us here now. I am based in Los Angeles, so it's still Tuesday evening for me. But in our US program, we also have a webinar series that runs on Thursdays in the morning in the US. So to give you a little orientation for today, we're going to have a webinar. It's going to run 1 hour for our public viewers here on the YouTube live stream. And then for all the accelerator companies in our Asia Pacific cohort, they'll be on the webinar. They'll be able to ask questions. At the end of the hour, we're going to have a live Q&A just for our cohort companies that will not be broadcast on the YouTube live stream. So the main live stream will end in the first hour, and then the rest of them will stay on for the final 30 minutes. And the way this works, as always, is if you have a question, you can place it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you're in our webinar, if you're watching on YouTube Live, there is a chat box on YouTube Live. You can use that to submit questions, which I will monitor, and I will try and work into the conversation as best I can. So with that, we're going to talk today about clinical trial design and management, something that's extremely important for most companies. There's always a few exceptions that don't do clinical trials in this space, but it's pretty rare. Studies are really the norm, and trial design and management is really maybe the most important thing you'll do as a company besides building your product. So we've got two expert panelists today to talk to us about this process and to answer some questions. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So we're going to start up first with Sundeep Sristavas from Paraxel. So Sundeep, tell us about yourself, your company.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Frederick, for the opportunity to join this interesting group. I work for a company called Paraxel. We are a clinical research organization. My headquarters, of course, is in US, but we have a strong base in Asia Pacific also. We cater to both pharmaceutical as well as medical device companies. And interesting to be in this space of medical device. I've been here for almost 20 plus years. And especially working with the startup group, it has been close to 5 years, both on the side of providing consultation, developing clinical trial strategy, to the conduct and execution, to working very closely on the teaching side also. So here in Singapore, I'm part of Singapore Biodesign as a visiting faculty. Also sit on the panel of Enterprise Singapore for funding for medtech companies for their proof of concept and proof of validation studies. And from a past life perspective, the background remains with Eli Lilly, Abbott Vascular for around 14 plus years. Then Quintiles or IQVIA now, which is a big CRO, and now with Paraxel. So that's my background.
Terrific, Sundeep. We're really lucky to have you here today, so thank you very much for that. Next up, Dr. Tina Sulis from Neuroscience Trials Australia. So tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everybody from a spring Melbourne, Australia today. I can actually say it's spring. It's been a long winter. It's been a long year for all of us. So I'm really delighted to be here talking to you about my experience. I guess that I've worked in clinical trials for over 25 years now. I started off as an academic. I have a PhD in diabetic complications, and that got me interested in working with industry. And in my career to date, I've worked with very, very large pharmaceutical companies. Most of them are, I guess, large contract research organizations. I've been a local director for a publicly listed, very successful biotechnology company here in Australia. And now for the past 9 years, I've been Chief Executive Officer of Neuroscience Trials Australia. As the name suggests, we are experts and we niche contract research organisation in all brain, anything to do with the brain. And that includes pharmaceuticals, lots of devices, increasingly devices, cell therapies. We work with phase 1 right across to phase 3, and even some health economic studies, which are phase 4 studies. And interestingly, we're located in Australia, but 80% of our clients originate from outside of Australia. And they come to Australia particularly for their early phase work, because unlike other areas around the world, you don't need to have an open IDE or IND like you do in other jurisdictions. And there's some great tax incentives, so you can set up a local company, and if you have a turnover of less than 20 million, which a lot of our audience does, and claim back 43.5% back of whatever you spend on R&D. So we're finding that's our particular clients, that's our sweet spot. That's what we mainly work with, lots of early phase, first in human studies. So hopefully I can impart some of my knowledge there for you today. And I'm going to talk holistically about clinical trials, and then sort of try and delve down into some of the specific questions you have as well. Thank you.
Terrific. So, you know, people from two great backgrounds, a ton of experience, you know, really excited about the conversation today. And Sundeep, it's great that you're working with Biodesign. I know those programs extremely well all around the world, and they're, you know, just a terrific source for companies that we find that really have had a really good foundation. And of course, in Melbourne, you know, what a great ecosystem, and you know, there's just so many amazing advantages to being there. So, two terrific places to be working and be interacting with innovators. So let's start off on that topic, maybe a little bit. First, you know, do you work routinely with small companies? I know, you know, a lot of people say, of course, you know, we work with large and small companies, but maybe just give us a sense of how often are you working with, like, you know, smaller companies, and how does the experience maybe differ between a small company and a larger sponsor in a study? So Tina, I'll start off with you.
Yeah, so the majority of our work, I guess, is on behalf of small companies. And when I say small, they're startups, they could be up to 40, 50, 100 people. And the reason, I guess I'd like to say it's like-minded in some ways, because we become part of that project team. And certainly, did you want me to give you some examples of companies that we've worked with, for example,
Sure,
in this space?
Great.
Yeah, yeah. So we do a lot of early phase work, as I said, first in human work, and we become part of that project team. And it's not just another project for us. So for example, we've done some really innovative work with the implantable device in epilepsy, a company called Cerebral Therapeutics that came to Australia, opened up a local subsidiary, and they were using a device that had been used before, but not for epilepsy, and not in the implantable way that they wanted to do it, and not used to deliver valproate, which is a very well-known anti-epileptic. But the two had never been put together. So we worked very closely with them. We provided a clinical field engineer, which was the point of contact with the company versus our project management team. They were able to tap into the R&D tax incentive and use the funds that they had to date very wisely. They didn't have to open up, you know, an IND, those sorts of things, but they were able to use the data from those clinical trials to then go on and raise more money with their stakeholders, and also now are running global clinical trials. So that's one example. We've also worked with a company called Synchron, which is smart stent as well, a very world first in class device. And we worked with them, we've been working with them for about 4 years now. So we also supported them in terms of the regulatory strategy. I know that's not the focus of the conversation today, but we were able to support them to design their clinical trials and actually get to first patient. Again, world first clinical trial, and provide the expertise in project management, in writing protocols. I'm going to hand over to Sundeep.
Thanks, Tina. I think that was very nicely explained. Also, the characteristics of the two organizations from a startup and from a big MNC point of view. So, Paul, like with the advantage which I got an opportunity to work with two MNC CROs, also being in Asia Pacific, which right now is kind of a hub for most of the new innovations which is coming up, and being in Singapore, which is really I will say is booming up with the new innovation with the startups and a lot of different programs which government has run, likewise in Australia, which has given opportunity to interact with a lot of new innovators. So I can say that, yes, I've worked with 3 people company and 10,000 people company. But and both opportunities have different requirements. When you get these innovators who are very enthusiastic, there is a lot of passion about what they are doing, and they are coming up with something which is related to unmet need. In their perspective, definitely they are catering something there. And how you can help align that from a concept to commercialization is the most interesting part of that discussion. Most of the times when you have these smaller startup companies, they have excellent technology or innovation of what they're working on. They have good expertise on the technical aspect of it. However, they definitely need a helping hand to understand the nuances on the device continuum. That how do you take from prototype to proof of concept? How do you take proof of concept to validation and develop your first in human and safety data, and then kind of take it to commercialization and generating that data from your reimbursement perspective? I think that is where we see a lot of keenness in the startup segment. On the other side, if you look into multinational, you may have very specified teams into each different areas, and then they pretty much need a counterpart in the organization to cater to those needs. So both have their interesting dynamics. Something which I recently recall is a company which was working on a innovative nephrology device. This was a portable dialysis machine. They started working initially almost, I think, 8 to 10 years back on the concept, had their own rounds of failures because of the approaches which they did. That also talks about the resiliency which was there and how we kind of overcome on putting up the right study design, gathering all the data which was useful, which was generated, and then kind of moving in to that opportunity. Now it has become a breakthrough technology. That's the status which is granted by FDA, got supported by a very handsome series funding, and are pretty much on the way of bringing out the beta design to play into first in human study for beta design. So that's the beauty of bringing these companies up to speed and from concept to commercialization.
That's great. It's interesting when you talk about breakthrough. There was that announcement today that CMS is going to be covering companies initially that have breakthrough designation right away, which is a huge advantage now for companies that have managed to get that. So for those companies that are covering both Asia and US, that's a pretty big, exciting piece of news. But again, we're not going to stick too much on reimbursement today and those other topics, but I did want to mention it. But one topic that we can't get away from is COVID. It's something that I think we're all living with, right? It's our everyday. For some of us, in other regions, things feel maybe somewhat normal. Here in the U.S., certainly anything but normal. I'm here in my house. And are working from home. So I know in clinical trials, there's certainly been an impact in different regions in different ways. And maybe just quickly, we can just discuss a little bit about, are we past the impact of COVID? I mean, I know it certainly delayed some studies. Are studies resuming? Are things back to normal? Kind of where are we in this continuum? And Sundeep, I'll start with you on that.
Sure, Paul. I think COVID has brought its own set of difficulties, challenges, at the same time, opportunities to really test new things. And practically the Q1, and I'll divide Asia probably into 2 parts. One of how North Asia has come up and how South and Southeast Asia and Pacific, of course, is on one side. So yes, the impact from a North Asia point of view initially when China and Taiwan, Korea, if we look into this area, and Japan, Now in Q2, that impact has kind of lowered down with all the good measures which were taken by different countries. So initially, the challenges, of course, was to even approach the site from an ongoing study point of view, challenge on monitoring, how do you monitor the data, challenge on how do you submit new proposals from an ethics committee approval point of view, how do you get your study started, and especially from a device studies which are having implants, since you don't have the subjects in the hospital, no procedures are going except for the emergency cases. It is really it was very difficult to get the right kind of patient population because they may not fit into your inclusion exclusion criteria. So yes, from an enrollment to follow up to even from looking into the critical cases and regular follow-ups and checks, that was difficult. What it brought an opportunity, as I was saying, it brought a use of technology in various advantages which we saw of that, from patient follow-up to patient screening. A lot of things have moved in the digital space, and the earlier things which we used to see from a screening perspective, since the consultation shifted on mobile, a lot of screening also shifted on mobile. So you can identify the right kind of subjects which need to be enrolled for a particular study based upon the teleconsultations which have started happening. Definitely it required putting up certain new processes, putting up certain necessary approvals, approaching the ethics committees. And even ethics committees have come to terms from electronic submission, remote reviews, real-time basis submission of data, and then of course their review and approvals. And this really helped in consolidating the conventional timeline, which used to vary from 30 days to 2 months time frame. In fact, some of the critical IVD studies or COVID studies got approval in a record time. So I know for some study in one of the country, the enrollment of 10,000 subjects happened in just 10 days. And that is the kind of a volume which was handled. And you can understand there was a team of 100 dedicated people just working on that study. And with all precautions, PPE kits, the kind of contact which was happening, we were able to manage that. And that is like with the flexibility of regulators, ethics committee, staff, and also at the same time from a patient and team point of view. So we have seen a lot of different examples of innovation and optimization of technology.
That's great, super helpful. Thank you for those examples. And Tina, how about on your end? What are you seeing in terms of COVID-19 and not only the impact, but are things reasonably back to normal, or where are we?
Yeah, so thank you. I would echo with Sundeep's reflections there as well. That's certainly what we've seen in Australia and through our client base, which are largely outside of Australia, as I said at the start. We're still on a continuum because things are still changing around the world. I don't think we're quite out of the woods yet. However, I think excitingly, there are lots of silver linings for the way forward and the way that the future of clinical trials, the streamlining of clinical trials. For example, at the start of COVID, we saw a hectic scramble for all of our projects to have amendments done such that they were able to accommodate home visits. And the home visits would be, and we've seen a huge rise. We were already working with lots of organisations such that we went out to the study participant and undertook the assessments or dispensed study product or analysed or collected whatever data we needed to collect remotely, if you like. And that will not go away, and that will increase. It will become the norm now. And the exciting thing about that is for someone who's undertaking clinical trials, it means you can do that trial in theory, wherever you are around the world. And also for countries like Australia, we can access remote patients that might live hundreds of kilometres or miles away from one of our major cities where most of our population is. So that's really exciting. We've seen all of our ethics committees, they were meeting remotely anyway, but we've seen the turnaround times really decrease, as Sundeep has said that, and we've seen even more collaboration, more community engagement. One of the most exciting things I've seen in terms of clinical trials going forward is the community engagement. Never in my 25 careers do I recall turning on the television and in front of the newspapers, in front of television, are clinical trials. And therefore, we are educating the public about what's involved in a clinical trial, what it means to be in a clinical trial, dispelling the myths and educating them so that we take them with us through the development journey. And therefore, hopefully translating to a more efficient recruitment in all our clinical trials going forward for all of us that are going to be involved in clinical trials. But also we are seeing very much the remote nature of undertaking clinical trials. For example, we're involved with a client here in Melbourne in a COVID study that will be total remote, from e-consent to remote contactless dispensing of study medication, to remote gathering of information. And the only time we might get to see that participant is if they end up in hospital because of COVID complications. And that, I think, we're going to see more and more outside of COVID. We will see that as part of the new future of more streamlined clinical trials, use of electronic information, and also artificial intelligence and machine learning in order to pre-screen suitable participants into these studies.
So,
to me, that's exciting.
Yeah, no, it's exciting to me too. It's exciting to hear, about the incredible speed of enrollment, Sundeep, that you were just talking about as examples. And certainly, I think you make a great point, Tina, that everyone's talking about clinical trials right now in a way that, that we've probably never seen before.
Yes.
We're all certainly, heavily aware of all the vaccine studies and everything else that's happening. So
yes.
there's definitely silver linings, and plus, the remote care and the changes to the way patients are being visited, in their homes remotely, instead of sending out nurses or, or coming in for a visit. A lot of the things that were unnecessary that, were just part of the protocols before. I think I agree. I think those things are here to stay. So I'm excited about those changes, and I think we're really going to streamline things as a result. And plus, just even trying to scale in general, trying to address all these challenges, just like even like being on Zoom right now, right, for all these things. I think we're going to see, long-lasting impacts. So, I'm excited about a lot of those things. I'm hoping, for some of the companies, in our program and companies that we've talked to who've had studies delayed, I'm hoping those are coming back soon, or certainly, that they're going to be able to enroll faster. I'm generally hearing things are pretty good, but occasionally in some regions like China, for example, I've heard people who are still saying that their studies are delayed until the end of the year, until the beginning of next year. So, there's certainly still some impact, but.
So on that point, Paul, can I just add that what we are seeing is a little bit of change of guard as to how companies do their clinical trials and plan for them in these uncertain times. And what we're doing with our clients, and I'm sure Sundeep is probably the same, is getting them trial ready up to a time point where they can start recruitment. And then we pause the project if we need to, so that they don't lose momentum and time at the other end of it. So we try and be as proactive and plan and bring everything up to that first patient, first visit as much as possible. And then if it's circumstances demand that we can't do that, then at least that trial is ready to go at the point that we can do that. So we haven't stopped work behind the scenes, and we're certainly doing a lot of that. The other thing that we're seeing is, because, all you folks out there have other stakeholders you need to manage, like boards that then, talk about finance and usually have a finite amount of funds. We're also doing more and more formal feasibilities for our clients, so that we really delve deep into how we're going to undertake this project. And then they can take that back to their stakeholders and really plan about how they will execute that project in the budget that they've got and the time that they've got.
Actually, it's a really good point you just made. And I'm just curious now, when you say that, you're helping to educate their boards and, maybe their stakeholders, are they having you, has anyone had you come make a presentation to their investors or to their board to give them an update on what's happening with clinical studies? Do people ever bring you in to do that?
Yes, that's absolutely routine. Even before COVID, that is part of the remit of particularly for smaller companies, whereby, as Sundeep was saying, it could be a brilliant, and usually is a brilliant, either medico or scientist or engineer that has this amazing product, and a business person, but they may not necessarily know about how to do a clinical trial, the regulatory strategy, how long things take, how much they cost. They're always dumbfounded by why does it cost that much and why does it take that long. So part of my role, I see, is to advocate for the detail behind those numbers and the timelines, and to educate people about the value proposition of what we can offer as clinical trialists, as specialists in our field, to support the team.
Great, good.
Probably, Paul, I'll expand this a little bit and taking a step back into the whole process. And as we are seeing that change, especially when you talk about from a funding perspective, and if you're moving from a Series A to a B point of view, definitely the need for clinical evidence becomes so critical that it is not only that outline which you have to provide, you'll have to provide some amount of clinical data to kind of get that kind of a support on funding aspect. So especially discussing with the startups and the medtech teams here, what I talk and discuss with them is going back to the basic on what is your intended use. Because it is a kind of a very sequential flow which comes into design and moving up to your persuasion on from an investor point of view. Most of the time, there is a lot of confusion between indication for use and intended use. And this differentiation helps really define your risk classification. As we know in Asia, the risk classification varies a lot. You can have A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Different countries have their different requirements, and that's how they have classified. So when you're trying to find out your path of least resistance from an entry perspective, it becomes very critical to define your intended use appropriately, such that your classification gets defined. And then as you take it from your commercial and clinical strategy, it becomes very important, because the endpoint, the primary endpoint as you're trying to define, it gets linked to your intended use. That's how you define your endpoint. And when you are moving from your safety study with first in human, that is what you are taking as a endpoint from a safety perspective, and driving that initial data in 10 to 15 subjects, that how your device is safe to bring that data or evidence which can support your intended use, because that's what is going to go on the label. How you can bring this linkage. And on the parallel, of course, you have the regulatory on top, the intended use, how you're trying to bring in has to align with the regulatory strategy in a country. So you can define that, okay, what I have to do from a regulatory aspect, and at the same time, as you're assessing your market viability on potential and others, that also helps you to define which segment you're playing, which is your predicate, what they have done, and where, if it is a novel product, and how you are trying to address, or are you creating a new endpoint which was never measured earlier? And then you have to go into association or consortiums to get that KOL buy-in to bring into it. So when I connect with these dots, so I go back to from intended use and then try to bring it upfront, so that as you are designing your clinical trial and taking this data to the next level from a funding point of view, you are able to sell that story more comprehensively, covering all the different points.
No, that's great, great from both of you. So I appreciate that. Let's talk a little bit more. Sundeep, you did a great job of kind of just giving us the overview on, you got to start off with your intended use. What are some other things that companies should consider or have in place, when they come and sit down and talk with you for the first time, with either of you? What should they have, and what should they be ready to talk about? What do they need to have in place? before they plan their clinical studies, in addition to, you know, their intended use. So Tina, why don't I go for you for this first?
Yeah, I think just to expand on what Sundeep was saying, the way I see it, and when we talk to our clients, is particularly if they don't have a clinical expert within their group, and I'm not talking about a key opinion leader. I'm talking about a in-house clinical expert or clinician in the very least, not even a clinical trialist. They need to have the end in mind. So in the ideal world, it should be a target product profile, or as Sundeep was saying, what information do they need to get to get approval of their product for that particular use. And then we can work backwards, because it could be that they just need to do one pivotal study. It could be that they need to do their first in human. You know, it's always about safety. We're always collecting safety information, but then we need to collect that, you know, proof of concept, that the data that the regulators would expect to see, of the proof of efficacy, the proof of safety as well. So then we would consider, do they have clinical experts? Who will they, because we can run the clinical trials, we can help design the clinical trials, but at the end of the day, have they sought input from clinicians that are going, or end users of the product? You can have fabulous ideas of how your product would work, on who you wanted to sell, who you want the end user to be, the end payer, I guess. But if that doesn't really work in the real world because you haven't sought that advice, it's always really good to think about that and come to us with some sort of idea of what that might look like. And also the timing, because the costs of a clinical trial will always be around the number of subjects, the number of sites, and the length of treatment. They're the three main drivers of the study. So do they have an end in mind? Do they want this product on the market next year? But knowing that they have to have 5,000 patients treated with that particular indication, that might not be realistic. So they need to know in terms of what does their board or their stakeholders expect in terms of when this product will be on the market and what would be the intended use, and then we can work backwards. And then we can fill in the gaps of what's required. Also, when they come to us, they should have an idea of the preclinical information that they have available. And often we are asked to look at that. And one of the value-added things that our group does, and I'm sure Sundeep's group does as well, is look at the preclinical data that a client may have to that date. It could be academic trials, it could be from the literature, bringing it all together. And then we spend a few hours and look at that from a big picture point of view, and note the gaps, I guess, in the preclinical information, because at the end of the day, to go from preclinical or developmental concept into a clinical trial, you need to satisfy, in some countries, the regulatory authorities, but definitely you need to satisfy an IRB or an ethics committee that your product is safe and the risk to benefit is there to go into human beings. So that's just a big picture, general view of what they need when they come to talk to us about their project.
Thank you. Very comprehensive. So, Sundeep, let me ask you, how long does it take to plan these studies? You know, how far in advance should someone contact you, be engaging with a CRO in advance of the time they actually plan to do their study?
See, what I would recommend, once you are in that early stage of very close to your prototype, I think the three critical components which trigger pretty much in parallel is working on regulatory strategy, commercial strategy, as well as a clinical strategy. And they, as I said, go pretty much hand in hand, because as you have developed, you are addressing an unmet need, you have developed a device, you start thinking about the market. So that's where your commercial strategy already kicks in. You look into the market and do that search of any predicate, what kind of a potential you're estimating from a revenue perspective. And then you start working on, hey, which is my country of focus where I have to take this product? What is the regulatory needs? What does the regulator need to commercialize my product? At the same time, you also start thinking about the end users. which in device case, most of the time, from a company perspective, it is first the physician or surgeon who is using the device, and then of course, along with that, the patient who is receiving it. So what value I'm bringing into the market, how this will be used, what kind of requirements will be there from a physician perspective, because here it is implanter, it's not popping a pill. Somebody has to implant, so has to have the right kind of a qualification to do that. And these are the things which has to come and on that blackboard itself as you're planning. So you can't take your product to a technical due diligence and then start thinking that what will be the endpoints I'll be generating evidence on. Because this starts pretty much when you have defined your intended use, and that's how it moves forward. So pretty much way early in the game, that's what I'll recommend.
Early, good. That's the advice we give people too. Yeah, early as possible. Okay. So one of the things that I get a question about a lot is, you've got your product development team and your clinical, development team. And, a question that people ask is, how do you have a healthy, productive relationship between the two?
Mm-hmm.
So Sundeep, I'll start with you on
that. I'll bring one more team into it, and that is marketing. Because when a product development is happening and from an R&D perspective, of course, you may be based upon a feedback in which you've generated an unmet need, you start working on different devices. And as it happens with a physician or an engineer, whatever they develop, they think this is the best and this is what the market needs. I'm not saying this is wrong. This is absolutely correct, that what they are bringing is really an innovation. How it marries with other segments has to be brought in alignment. A lot of times when I've been discussing with the companies, they will be having aspirations to generate clinical evidence, which is on the topmost requirement. Say, if I'll be doing a randomized control trial with 1,000 subject, 500 subject each arm, and then I'll be trying to go on subset analysis with diabetics, with different comorbidities, and try to find all these things. But when you're trying to have these kind of data generated, yes, it is very good because you'll have a lot of evidence to cater into various segment and indication. Together, if you plan to do all these things, probably it will take 5 to 10 years to really commercialize your product. That's why I said bring marketing into it, because there has to be the so to say reality check to bring that by when should we have the product in the market, and the viability of that product as an unmet need before the competition really kicks in or the technology changes. Device, we all know the shelf life, so to say, of device is very less. This is not like pharmaceutical, where a product can be on the shelf for 20 years. Here, the device market is so dynamic that a technology changes in 3 to 5 years. So if you don't bring the product fast, there will be somebody else with a new technology. And that's how it evolves. With R&D, I'll also put marketing and clinical together as a think tank of what should be coming and when it should be coming. Because clinical can help design you the strategy, but marketing will help you phase out your product development. That do you have to bring all the product in one go, or you kind of break it into parts like our mobile industry does. They bring iteration and new products. I come from Abbott, so I've seen this in implementation when 2000 timeframe when I was launching bare metal stents. These were stents which are made up of stainless steel. We upgraded from that to next generation, which was cobalt chromium. We upgraded from that coming up with thinner struts. So profile was changing. And then of course, incremental clinical data was getting achieved. And then of course, we made a big jump to moving to bioresorbable scaffolds. So it was a complete jump from having a metallic stent to something which dissolves and disappears in a period of time. Now, if if I would have given only to physicians and engineers, probably they would have thought to bring everything in one go. But when it came with marketing, it got spread out, saw the right market capitalization, and clinical then define the right clinical strategy to bring what regulators need. That's another point. What regulators need. You may generate 10,000 patient data, but regulators may just need 100 patient data. You don't need 10,000 patient data.
Right.
I was going to say you really need to have regulators in that mix as well. And I find the biggest struggle of most smaller companies that are developing a device or a product or whatever product it is getting the ideas and concept into reality. And the most sobering thought that I always leave people with is that we live in an what we do is evidence-based science. It's all based on gathering the evidence we need to be able to support the claims that the regulators will agree with to approve the product that you're developing. And the most sobering thought that helps them decide often is that, well, you can have the most amazing endpoints and collect the most amazing data in one trial, but just think of it like this: what every single data point that you decide that you need to capture in this wonderful trial, you have to program. Someone has to pay to monitor it. Someone has to pay to analyze that data. You have to then pay someone to put it into a clinical study report. And then the regulators, it's more information that they need to review. And everybody has to be paid along the way. And everybody has to, we have to double and triple check that one data point. So that often, when it translates to time and money, they then sit back and go, okay, what do you actually need? And the biggest struggle I find with companies isn't just the regulators, the clinicians, the engineers, the marketing people talking. It's deciding what they're going to put into their trial. So I always say to them, what do you need? What is the endpoint? Stick with the endpoint. It could be that you pull out the others into smaller sub-studies, because often, like Sundeep just said, we find that we start with one device, it might be the prototype, but through the trial, the first feasibility or smaller trial that we do, we have learnings that will then adapt to a better or more efficient device. And then we haven't used all our money in just that beautiful, Rolls-Royce clinical trial, if you like. We're getting to the end result in a more efficient way. And that's what I always find. I always try and work with them. What is it exactly that you need? What's a nice to have? What's a need to have in your project?
Yeah, good points. I know we'll talk a little bit about the cost of studies in a minute. You mentioned before, Tina, the idea of how, if somebody has a clinical trialist or, a chief medical officer, somebody in-house, which a lot of these companies don't. So maybe, Sundeep, let me ask you then, are there some of these, what can be done in-house and what should be outsourced? And can a startup run their studies without a CRO? Can that be done? So Sundeep, give me some of your thoughts on that.
See, to answer this, I'll go back on what is your device really doing. If you are bringing, say, a class 1 device, then of course you don't need clinical trial. If you're bringing a class 2 device, and depending upon what amount of risk factors it is doing. So whether you say, if in a US parlance, if I'm saying, if you're approaching a 510K kind of a need, then you have to do substantial equivalence and more of a literature search, trying to see how predicate devices have followed that path, what kind of literature is available. And then even with a single center small data, you may be in a position to satisfy the need which the agency is requiring you to register your product. In those environments, if you find that capabilities in-house to be able to do that, then probably instead of going for a CRO, you may look into a selective service offering, whether you require a regulatory service, whether you require just a literature search, or whether you require a small investigator-initiated study which can be run in conjunction with an institute. and you can generate a single center data. So I'm just giving example in Asia. Of course, Australia, Tina will talk in detail about it as a good place to do such kind of trials, but other places like Korea. So you have centers like SNUH or ASAN, who has got their internal unit, so much said, the clinical trial unit, so to say. Some of these centers even provide services from a preclinical stage to even coming up to clinical and generating data, working on the right reports for you. And for those kind of devices, I think then you don't require a full-fledged services from a CRO. However, if you're moving to high-end devices on class 2 with higher risk segment or class 3 devices, then definitely the regulatory requirements on these risk classification are well defined. Every country has got its own nuances in terms of documentation, data comparison, standards to be followed. So just to give example, of course, we all follow GCP or ISO requirements from a conduct of clinical trials, but China has specific requirements for China, like the type testing or now, of course, HGRAC cert, which is there, which is needed. These are specific requirements to that country. Or Japan, which has got Japan JCP, JGCP, which they say, and also they define their studies as ICCC studies. When you're going into a post-marketing kind of thing, the documentation is very different. Now, to expect a company to have that kind of a knowledge, reach, and understanding, I doubt whether a startup will have it. So definitely you need the right partners to take you along the right path, the path of least resistance at the time, along with the path of compliance, so that you can take your product into different countries. And obviously, how we can optimize your dollar. That is the key crux of it, because these different requirements, can I generate that data in Australia and take it to China? Or can I take Australia data to US? Can I take Taiwan data into China, which is an easier way, or a Hong Kong data into China? Yes, there are possibilities. There are the new alliances which are there, which can help this. And that's where the partners have got the understanding, reach, experience, and the right set of capabilities to help support you. And that is where it has to be involved pretty much early, so that it can be a virtual team, as Tina was saying, and we work in tandem to help support you commercialize your product much effectively.
All right. Well, you've convinced me, Sundeep. I need to work with a CRO. So that.
Can I just add to that? Can I just give a little bit of a different perspective on that? Just to that, both Sundeep's company and my company, our company, they can provide the full service. They can do the concept. They can write that. We can write the protocol. We can write the clinical study report and everything in between. But you, as your company, and you as the client, can opt to only take parts of what you need from either Paraxel or NeuroTrials Australia. So what the sort of setups that we have seen companies use is they might have an internal clinical project manager, but then outsource the monitoring to a contract research organization. They may, as Sundeep said, just use the boutique services in particular countries for regulatory. But one thing I'd like you also all to consider is that at the end of the day, the data of whatever you're collecting on your product, the data becomes your asset. And unless you have that data in a way that the regulators will accept, then it will all the efforts will be for nothing. So if anything, I would not I'll go to the expense and the effort of having data management and biostats internally, particularly for smaller companies. I would definitely outsource data management and biostats to the experts, because it can be a very costly exercise. And if you don't collect it, it's not about collecting it in an Excel spreadsheet. It needs to be part 11, 21 CFR compliant. You need to speak the talk of the regulators. And as I said, even if you want to on-sell and license out that product, raise more money, unless that data is collected in a way that is acceptable, it will be all for nothing. I just wanted to make that point as well.
No, it's a great point, Tina. And I was going to say, I'm convinced that we should be working with CROs. And then the question is, are there things that can be split? So you answered my question, so thank you for that. So let's move on then and talk about funding, since I know there's some innovative funding models out there for doing clinical studies. And it's one of the things that, I hear a lot from startups is, are there ways that, that we should be thinking about that we're not thinking about to fund these clinical trials? I know before you mentioned tax credits and things in Australia. So just what are some examples that you can both give? I'll start with you, Tina, on this, on innovative ways of funding studies that a small company might overlook.
Well, the great news on this is that we all work in a global environment. There are nuances, whether you're, as Sundeep said, whether you're in Taiwan and China or the US. But at the end of the day, if the product is fabulous, you can usually collaborate with someone in the US, even if you're sitting in Singapore or Australia. And we have lots of examples of clients that have been able to obtain NIH funding, for example, through a particular department. And the same is true for Australia. So I think I mentioned before that you can, if you're a small, if you have a turnover of less than 20 million, you can set up an Australian Delaware company, I think it's called in the US, or Australian subsidiary, and you can claim 43.5% back of whatever you spend. And that's a cash back when you put in your tax return. There are also initiatives in Australia, as I'm sure there are around the world. There's one in particular that's about 4 years old now called Medical Research Future Funding. And it's all about collaborating with not just with CROs, but with key opinion leaders, with institutes, with your company to co-develop a product. And there are millions of dollars given out each year, tens of millions actually, and they do call outs for either devices or unmet needs, rare diseases, oncology, whatever it is. So always good to have local contacts, whether it's in Singapore, Australia, China, with people that are experts in the area and have their ear to the ground. And one way you can do that in all of your countries is, of course, not only through Medtech Innovation type of setups, but I know definitely Australia, and the same is true for other countries, there are either state representatives or country representatives, and you should get to know them, and because they will either connect you to institutes in the particular countries or make you aware of these type of incentives that you can tap into, the grant opportunities. I'll leave it there so Sundeep can add to that as well.
Actually, this topic is should be answered by Paul, you and Frederick, because funding is something which is close to you guys, and the pitch events which you do. Probably I'll defer this to you.
All right, great.
Good
Well,
point.
thank you for deferring it to us. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of innovative ways, and we certainly talk with our startups. But I'm glad you've offered some ideas, Tina, on that. So then, why don't we move on and talk a little bit about the way people choose their. Well, actually, before I get to choosing sites, one last question I had, something that you made me think of, Tina, which is, you're talking about some of the innovative opportunities in Australia and costs of, working in a global ecosystem. Are there certain countries in the Asia Pacific region that cost less to execute clinical studies? So we've already talked about Australia. What about India, China? Like, is there an advantage to doing studies in those regions as well? Either of you.
Okay.
I might defer that to Sundeep to start off with.
Sure. Thanks.
Sorry, Sundeep.
See, from a cost point of view, it really goes with the way on country economy of how these tests are. And I'll give you a comparative that, say, example, a blood test in a particular country, which has to be done. Depending upon that economy, it can vary in Malaysia to if you're doing a study in Indonesia, or from there, if you're taking to Taiwan, to China, to Korea, and to Singapore. So it can vary on that cost. And the criticality of that is whether you want to consider the cost of doing an activity in a particular country, or rather thinking it more from the scientific merit of where the incidence of diseases, where is the patient population, which is my target country to do, because end of the day, I'm trying to follow a requirement for that particular country. Yes, in case if you have checked all these boxes and then you find that, okay, I can generate a data in Malaysia and can optimize that in Korea. Probably I'll have to add 2 sites in Korea and or 2 sites in Malaysia. Yes, those kind of permutation combination can be built in. Having said that, I would not base my strategy on generating clinical evidence on budgeting alone, because it has to fit the purpose for which I'm generating the clinical evidence. And if I'm not able to generate the right kind of a data and which caters to my market needs, that data is of no use to me. But having said that, yes, when you're defining the strategy from Asia, if I generate evidence in Australia, many of the times we have seen the acceptance in US and EU. A lot of time, Australia, Singapore, and Korea has been countries where first in human trials have been conducted because of the standard of care, which is pretty much similar in these countries. It is able to bring homogeneous data which fits to the requirement for EU regulators from a CE mark point of view, as well as from a FDA rationalization perspective to build on the US trial. So yes, these countries become a good basis. Within China and within India, see, China needs the local data for China registration. Likewise, India needs the India data for India registration. So you will have to conduct, the number of subject data can vary based upon device, what you're bringing in. But that trial has to be done because this is in-country requirement. And that is where you'll have to bring up your strategy very comprehensively, that where do I need this in-country requirements to be fulfilled? Then there is no other way, but you'll have to generate that data there.
And if you look at big countries and regulators such as the FDA, their remit and their whole purpose is there to protect the safety and well-being of the populations. And they need that data to be representative of the population that they serve. Yeah. So you can't expect to do a trial just in China with all Asian, genetically made up participants and then submit all of that data to the FDA, because that's not going to be representative of the population in that country. That's another consideration, as Sundeep was saying. So it isn't just all about the cost. Cost is also tied to the recruitment, of course, and there were trends years ago with recruiting a lot in either South American countries or Eastern European countries because it was less costly, but also because the rate of recruitment was faster, generally because unlike the countries that Sundeep mentioned, Singapore, Australia and Korea, where healthcare is relatively free, it's available to everybody and they have various options, some of those countries don't. And that's then translated to recruitment being faster, cost being a little bit more cost effective. However, then you need to look at the quality of the data that comes out of those jurisdictions as well. So there's lots to consider. It's not just about the cost. I would agree with what Sundeep was saying. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, unbelievably, we've already gone through an hour. I don't know how that happened so fast. I still had about 15 more questions to go. So luckily, we still have time for some private Q&A after this. But if we had time, I would certainly do a part 2 here, because there's so much more to cover. And obviously topics like regulatory, there's plenty more. But this has been really interesting, a really good perspective. Maybe we can close with one final question for each of you, and then you can tell us how to reach you. But last question is, some common mistakes that maybe you see startups, earlier stage companies, just have to be startups, but smaller companies make common mistakes, and some tips that you would offer to avoid those. So I'll start with you, Tina, and then I'll go to Sundeep.
Yes, I would say there are general trends in the, I would say, mistakes or lessons learned. I wouldn't even call them mistakes, because they're usually learnings, because there is no such thing as a simple trial. There's no such thing as one trial being exactly the same as another. That is for sure. Every single project has its own challenges and merits. But one thing I will say is, please start to plan as far ahead as you can for the trials. Things always take longer, they always cost more. So budget, get different quotes. But some of the things that I've seen is that the CRO size may not be the right or might not be the right fit for that particular client at that point of time. And I think Sundeep really lovely outlined that before when saying that for the smaller studies versus doing a big global study. So that's one thing we've seen. And also I said before about the way that the data is collected. I know some of our clients come to us and say, but why we're not sure what we're going to do with this product, but so why do we need, the Part 1121 CFR compliant data management systems and the way we collect the data? Because the data is your asset. So you need to collect that and need to invest the time and effort in collecting that. And just really, it's always budget for more and plan for more time than you need is really the take-home message. And start talking to the CROs in particular at least 6 months ahead of your first patient, first visit, at least, for any project. Yeah.
Good advice, Sundeep.
I'll keep it basic. Do focus and spend time on your intended use, because that helps you define throughout your path. As Tina's saying, bring your regulatory, clinical, and commercial strategy pretty much early in the stage so that you can look into the interdependencies of this. If you have designed your prototype and you are selecting it for your first in human or proof of concept, don't try to bring every possible things to be tested in your endpoints. Test your safety on a basic parameter, and then you can move up to the next thing. And lastly, device iteration is even possible during the study in the early stage. Proof of concept, first in human, you can change the design, you can bring up your beta product, and then you can do a pivotal study which goes for approval. This is, I think, only possible from a device perspective in the rest of the markets. And that's a unique thing. So don't think that you cannot change your product. You can still change. You can, and use the earlier data also to your benefit for your product registration. So that would be my 4 basic things.
Thank you. Those are great. All right. So let's close then with the last thing, which is how do people find you? So Sundeep, how do people locate you? Is it LinkedIn? Is it your website? Well, how do people track you down?
Of course, LinkedIn is one option, but definitely I'll share my email ID and credentials later, and I will seek your help, the innovator help, to circulate it to the audience, and we can get connected through that.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll post it on YouTube as well then if you'd like. And Tina?
Likewise, so LinkedIn, our website, and I can share my details through Medtech Innovator as well.
Great, terrific. Well, as I said, I had a lot more questions, so we covered a lot, but there's so much more to unpack. So really fascinating, great insights, and great advice. So thank you both for sharing that with us. We also, as I mentioned before, for anyone who's watching this on YouTube Live, we'll have this webinar every Wednesday. So please join us again next week, and you'll be able to hear some more exciting topics coming up. If you go to medtechinnovator.org/APAC Live, you'll be able to see the schedule of our upcoming webinars as well as our past webinars. So please do that. You can also subscribe to our channel to get notifications of videos when they're being posted and when we go live. So I want to make one last plug too for the upcoming Asia Pacific MedTech Forum. Our stars are all going to be showcasing there. So if you're interested in learning more about these companies, you can go to medtechinnovator.org and you can click on the link for our Asia Pacific program to learn about the companies. But you can also Google the Asia Pacific MedTech Forum, and specifically the virtual MedTech Forum, which will be coming up September 24th. So hopefully we'll see you all there. And minimally, we'll look forward to seeing you again next week, hopefully here on the channel. So thank you again, panelists. Great discussion today. For anyone, the panelists, please stay on for our private Q&A, and the same thing for our startups. I'm going to go ahead and stop the live stream. So thanks everyone. For anyone who's leaving us, have a great day.